My grandfather is the one who taught me to fish, and my grandfather is the one I left on the boat. And I want you to know which of those two things is the more important before I tell you anything else. I am 17 years old. I will be 18 in November. I'm writing this in the front room of my grandfather's house, which is now my house, on a green vinyl couch that he bought in 1991, with a glass of warm orange soda on the side table because the ice in the freezer has not refrozen properly since the power came back on. And the television in the corner is on with no sound, because I do not like the quiet, but I also do not want to listen to anyone talk. I am writing this on the back of a stack of charter receipts because there is no good paper in this house, and because my grandfather kept everything. And his stack of charter receipts goes back 9 years, and the backs of them are blank. And I have a pen that works. We went out on a Tuesday morning in the second week of August. I want to give you that because everything you are about to read happened in less than 30 hours, between a Tuesday at 6 in the morning and a Wednesday at noon. And I think the shortness of it is part of what I am still trying to understand. The summer had been hot in the way summers had started being hot the last few years, where the heat sat on the water at night and did not lift, where the air at 4 in the morning, when we loaded the boat, was the same temperature as the air at 4 in the afternoon, where my grandfather had taken to running the boat's small cabin fan 24 hours a day to keep the electronics from sweating. The forecast for Tuesday and Wednesday had been clean. 5 to 10 knots out of the southeast, seas 1 to 2 feet, visibility 10 miles, no chance of precipitation, a high in the upper 90s on land and the upper 80s on the water. The forecast had been the same forecast we'd been getting all summer. The forecast had been correct all summer. There was no reason to think the forecast for that Tuesday would not also be correct. My grandfather is 68. He has owned a charter boat out of a small marina on the Gulf Coast of this state for 31 years. The boat is a 32-foot center console with twin outboards named after my grandmother, who has been dead for 12 years. The boat sleeps two in a small cuddy cabin under the foredeck, has a head that mostly works, a galley with a single-burner propane cooker, a marine radio, a chart plotter that he replaced last spring, a depth finder, a fish finder, a downrigger on each side, a live well, 2 coolers, and a small refrigerator that runs off the house batteries when the engines are off. He runs the boat himself. He has not had a deckhand in 4 years, since the last deckhand, a young man named Trevor, finished his apprenticeship and got hired on a bigger boat in Florida. Since then, my grandfather has run his charters with no help, which he is allowed to do under the regulations he runs under, although the regulations were not written with a 68-year-old man with one bad knee in mind. I am the help now. I have been the help every summer since I was 12, when my parents started letting me ride out with him on the weekends I was at his house, which became most weekends after the divorce, and then every weekend, and then the whole summer. And then the whole summer plus winter break and spring break. And then I moved in with him for my junior year of high school, because the school district was better here than where my mother had moved with her new husband. And now I'm about to start my senior year. And I've lived in this house for 2 years. And I have not been on a boat without my grandfather in 9. He has taught me everything I know about the water. He has taught me how to read a chart, how to tie the 4 knots that matter, how to back a trailer down a ramp without jackknifing it, how to listen to the engines for the small, wrong sound. That means a problem before the problem becomes a problem. He has not taught me how to run the boat alone. I want you to understand that. He has taught me everything I know about the water, and he has not taught me how to run the boat alone, because he had not yet decided that I was ready, and because we both assumed there would be more summers. The trip on Tuesday was not a charter. It was supposed to be a trip just for us, the kind we did 3 or 4 times a summer, where we ran out to a wreck he liked about 42 nautical miles offshore in about 110 feet of water, anchored up, and fished for grouper and amberjack for a day and a night, and came back the next morning with a full cooler. It was an old wreck, a small freighter that had gone down in a storm in the 1950s, that had collapsed into itself over the decades, and that now held the kind of structure the bigger fish liked. He had been fishing it for 30 years. He had the GPS coordinates written in 3 places in case the chart plotter failed. In the small black notebook he kept in the dry box on the boat. In the larger ledger he kept in the desk in the front room of this house. And on a yellow legal pad on the kitchen counter, which is where I'm sitting now. And I'm looking at the coordinates as I write this, and I'm not going to write them down for you. I do not want anyone going to the wreck. I do not want anyone going anywhere near it. We left the marina at 5:50 in the morning. The sun was not quite up. The water in the marina was flat and the color of weak tea. The fuel dock was closed, but we had filled the tanks the night before. 240 gallons total between the main and the auxiliary, which was more than we needed for the trip, and which was the way my grandfather did things. Because his rule was that you came back with at least a quarter tank, which on his boat meant 60 gallons, which meant you left with whatever you needed plus 60. The engine started cleanly. He let them warm up while I cast off the bow line and the stern line, and pushed us off the dock with my foot the way I'd learned to do when I was 13. He brought us out of the marina at no wake speed, past the line of sleeping boats and the empty fuel dock, and the small pelican that lived on the 3rd piling from the end, and that I had named Frank when I was 14. And I had named Frank because I had liked the name Frank. And Frank had been on the 3rd piling every morning of every fishing trip for 4 years. And Frank was there that morning. And I want to tell you that I noticed Frank and waved at Frank, because that is what I always did. And I do not remember if I did. I do not remember the last thing I said to Frank. Once we were past the breakwater, my grandfather opened the throttles to about 3,000 RPM, and we settled into a cruise at about 26 knots, which was the speed his boat did most efficiently with 2 people and a half load of fuel and the gear we had on board. The sun came up over the land behind us as we ran out. The water turned from tea-colored to green, and then to the blue-green it turned at about 10 miles out, and then to the deeper blue it turned at about 20. And we sat on the leaning post with the wind in our faces. And we did not talk much, because we did not need to. We had run out to this wreck enough times that the run was its own conversation. My grandfather drank his coffee from the steel thermos he had carried for as long as I had known him. I drank mine from a paper cup that I had bought at the gas station on the drive to the marina, because I had forgotten my thermos in the kitchen. He had looked at the paper cup when I handed him his thermos, and he had said nothing, because saying anything would have been the kind of small lecture he had stopped giving me a year ago. And he had stopped giving me those lectures because we both understood by now that I knew what I was supposed to do. And that when I did not do it, it was not because I had forgotten the lesson. It was because I had chosen not to follow it that morning. And he had decided that letting me make small bad choices and live with the small bad consequences was a better use of his last good years than correcting me about them. I want to tell you about my grandfather, and I want to do it now, because I do not know how much room I'm going to have for him later. He is a man who does not talk much and who, when he does talk, talks about specific things. The tide, the wind, the price of fuel, the behavior of a particular fish on a particular kind of bottom in a particular kind of light. He has never once, in 9 years of fishing with me, told me he loved me. He has also never, in 9 years of fishing with me, raised his voice at me. He has a way of standing in the cockpit of his boat, with his hand on the throttle that I have spent 9 years trying to learn, where his shoulders are loose and his feet are spread to the rolling of the deck, and his eyes are doing 4 things at once, and I have not learned it. I do not know if I will ever learn it. I would have needed more summers. We got to the wreck at 8:15. The wreck was where the wreck always was. The chart plotters showed it. The depth finders showed it. The broken column of the freighter rising off the bottom into a dome of structure that the fish liked. My grandfather brought us up current of it and let the boat drift back and drop the anchor in the way he had taught me, with the anchor going down off the bow and the rode paying out steadily until we had set it well up current of the wreck so that the boat would settle back over the fish without the anchor itself coming down on the wreck. He set the anchor, and we drifted back, and the rode came tight, and the boat held. He cut the engines. The silence after the engines was the silence I'd been hearing every summer of my life. The silence of the open Gulf, which is not really silence because there is always the small sound of the hull against the water and the small sound of the wind in the antennas on the hardtop and the small sound of seabirds somewhere in the distance, but which is the closest thing to silence that I have ever known. We fished. I want to tell you that the first day was a good day of fishing because that was what mattered then, and because it was. We had a good run on the gag grouper in the late morning, with my grandfather pulling up a fat one of about 15 pounds and me pulling up a smaller one of about 10. And we had the kind of slow, steady action on amberjack in the early afternoon that means you are in the right spot and the fish are interested and the bait is fresh. We ate lunch around 2. He had made sandwiches the night before and put them in the small refrigerator. He had also packed 2 apples and a bag of pretzels and 4 bottles of water and a half-gallon thermos of cold sweet tea. We ate at the leaning post with the rods and the holders and the lines down, and we did not talk much then either, because we were eating, and because the fishing did not require talk. The afternoon was hot, but the breeze was steady, and the boat rocked gently on the small swell. And the kind of feeling that I had on that boat on that afternoon was the feeling I have been chasing every day since. And I'm writing that down so that you understand the shape of what was lost. The first anomaly of the trip was not really an anomaly. I want to be honest about that. It was the kind of thing that, by itself, was nothing. Around 4 in the afternoon, while we were drinking the cold tea and waiting for the late afternoon bite to start, my grandfather looked at the horizon to the southwest, and he was quiet for a longer moment than he usually was quiet about the horizon. And then he said into the air, "That is a strange color." He said it the way he said most things, flat, without alarm. He said it the way he might have said the tide is turning or the wind is dropping. I looked where he was looking. The horizon to the southwest was a thin band of something that was not quite the color of the rest of the sky. It was not a cloud bank. It was not a storm front. It was a difference in the color of the air. A kind of dirty quality to the light, the way the air looks on a day when there is smoke from a faraway fire, and the smoke is thin to where you cannot see it as smoke, but you can see it as a wrongness in the color of the sun. I said, "Is that smoke?" He said, "I do not know." He looked at it for another moment, and then he looked back at his rod tip. He said, "No fires in the forecast." He said it in the voice he used for talking to himself, and that I had learned to listen to with the same attention I gave the voice he used for talking to me. He turned on the radio. The radio was the Marine VHF that he kept on at all times when we were on the water, tuned to channel 16, which is the channel that anyone in trouble would use, and which is also the channel that the Coast Guard uses for routine broadcasts, weather updates, and the small, steady stream of working chatter that any working coastal water has on it at any time of day. The radio had been quiet for most of the day, which was normal for a Tuesday afternoon offshore. He keyed it. He listened. He waited for the small carrier hiss that the radio gives when channel 16 is open and there is no one talking. The carrier hiss was there. The radio was working. He keyed the radio to channel 22 Alpha, which is the secondary working channel for the Coast Guard, and he listened. The carrier hiss was there. He keyed it back to 16. He left it on. For about an hour after that, my grandfather kept looking at the southwest horizon. He did not say anything more about it. The band of strange color did not seem to move closer. It did not seem to move at all. It hung there the way a stain on a tablecloth hangs, without spreading. The wind stayed at 5 to 7 knots out of the southeast, which was what the forecast had said. The sea stayed at 1 to 2 feet. The fish kept biting. The second anomaly was about an hour later. Around 5:15, the radio woke up. It did so without warning, which was normal, because radios wake up without warning. What was not normal was what came out of it. The voice that came out of the radio was a man's voice, and it was speaking in a flat, measured way. The way a Coast Guard watchstander speaks when he is reading a broadcast notice to mariners. And the voice said that there was a hazard advisory in effect for the area to the southwest, that all vessels in or near the area should monitor channel 16 for further updates, and that vessels should be prepared to follow instructions if instructions were issued. The voice repeated the message. The voice did not say what the hazard was. The voice did not give a position or a radius for the hazard. The voice did not give a call sign at the end of the broadcast, which is the thing a Coast Guard station does at the end of every broadcast. The small bit of identification that tells you where the message is coming from. The voice just stopped, and the carrier hiss came back, and after a few seconds the carrier dropped, and channel 16 was quiet again. My grandfather looked at the radio. He looked at me. He said, "That was not Coast Guard." He said it without explanation. I knew what he meant. He had heard 1,000 Coast Guard broadcasts over 30 years on this water. The one he had just heard had not been one. It had been a voice that was using the cadence of a Coast Guard broadcast and that had not used the format of a Coast Guard broadcast. He keyed the radio. He said into the mic, "This is the vessel out of the marina I'm out of. Calling any station, came across an unidentified advisory regarding a hazard to the southwest, requesting verification. Over." He used the boat's name when he said it. He did not say his own name. He gave the boat's documentation number after the boat's name, the way he was supposed to do. He let off the mic. He listened. The carrier hiss was there. No one answered. He keyed the mic again. He said the same thing. He let off the mic. He listened. The carrier hiss was there. No one answered. He keyed the mic a third time. He said the same thing. He added that he was approximately 42 nautical miles offshore at the position he gave, and that he could see what appeared to be discolored air on the southwestern horizon, and that he was requesting verification of the previous advisory. He let off the mic. He listened. This time, someone answered. A different voice, also a man, also flat and measured, came on the channel and said the name of his boat and said, "Return to port, over." That was all the voice said. The name of his boat, and the words "return to port" and the word "over." The voice did not identify itself. The voice did not give a reason. The voice did not give a recommended route. The voice did not say what the hazard was. The voice did not say whether the order was advisory or mandatory. The voice said the words "return to port" and then stopped. And the carrier hiss came back. And my grandfather sat at the helm with the mic in his hand for a long moment, with his face doing the thing his face did when he was trying to decide whether what he had just heard was a thing he should act on or a thing he should ignore. He keyed the mic. He said, "Station calling, please identify, over." The carrier hiss was there. No one answered. He said it again. The carrier hiss was there. No one answered. He tried channel 22 alpha. No one answered. He tried channel 9, which is the secondary calling channel that pleasure boaters use. No one answered. He went back to 16. He sat with the mic in his hand, and he looked at the southwest horizon for what was probably 30 seconds. And the band of strange color on the southwest horizon had not moved. And the wind was still 5 to 7 knots out of the southeast. And the fish were still biting. And the chart plotter still said the boat was where the boat was. He said into the air, "I do not like this." He hung up the mic. He started the engines. The engines started cleanly. He told me to bring up the anchor. I went to the bow. I worked the windlass. The anchor came up clean, which meant we had set it well in sand, away from the wreck, the way he had taught me. The anchor came aboard, and I cleated off the road, and I gave him the thumbs up that meant we were free. And he put the boat in gear and brought us slowly around to a heading of 035, which was the heading back to the marina. And he advanced the throttles, and we started to run for home. We had been running for about 4 minutes when the engines died. I want to tell you about the engines dying, because the engines had not died on my grandfather's boat in the 9 years I had been on it. The engines were the engines he had bought new 6 years ago and had maintained the way he maintained everything, which was by the book and on schedule and with his own hands when he could and with the dealer in town when he could not. The engines did not die. The engines purred. The engines, when he turned them off, turned off because he had turned them off. They did not die together. They did not die one at a time. They died together. They died in the middle of a normal cruise, at 3,000 RPM, with the fuel gauges showing more than half on both tanks, with the temperatures showing normal, with no warning lights, with no change in their sound in the seconds before they died. They were running. Then they were not running. The drop in noise was so sudden that for a moment I thought my ears had stopped working. The boat coasted, slowing, the wake fading behind us, the hull settling lower into the water as our speed bled off. My grandfather was already at the helm with both hands on the keys. He turned the port engine off and then on. The starter cranked. The engine did not catch. He tried again. The starter cranked. The engine did not catch. He turned the starboard engine off and then on. Same. He held the key longer. He let it go. He tried the port again. He tried the starboard again. The starters cranked. Both starters cranked clean. The batteries were full. The starters were doing their job. The engines were not catching. He sat at the helm for a moment. He looked at the gauges. The fuel gauges still showed more than half. The voltmeters showed full charge. The water pressure gauges, which had been showing normal pressure a minute earlier, now showed 0, because the engines were not running. The engines were not running, and the engines were not catching when he turned the keys, and there was no reason for them not to be catching. He said fuel. He said it to himself. He said it the way you say a word when you are testing it. He got up and went to the engine hatch at the stern and lifted it. The engines were the engines. They sat there in the cool, dim light under the hatch. 2 big white outboards canted up on their bracket, the fuel lines running into them, the wiring harness running into them, the lower units below the water. He bent down and he looked at the fuel filters. The fuel filters were the small clear bowls at the back of each engine where you could see the fuel in them. The fuel filters were empty. Not low, empty, dry. The clear bowls were the color of the inside of a clear bowl with nothing in it. He looked at them for a long time. He said, "That is not possible." He said it the way he had said that is a strange color about the horizon. Flat, without alarm, with a kind of distance, the way a man speaks when the thing he is looking at is not a thing he has a place for. He stood up. He went to the fuel tank inspection ports, which were two small round caps on the deck just forward of the engine hatch, one for the main tank and one for the auxiliary. He unscrewed the cap for the main tank. He looked down into the tank with his flashlight. He stood up. He did not say anything for a moment. He unscrewed the cap for the auxiliary tank. He looked down into it. He stood up. He said, "Both tanks are dry." I went to the inspection ports myself. I looked into the main tank. I looked into the auxiliary tank. I had not been trained to do this, and I did not know exactly what I was looking for. But I had seen the inside of those tanks before, when they had been half full. And I knew what the fuel looked like at the bottom of the tank, when there was fuel at the bottom. And there was no fuel at the bottom of either tank. The bottoms of the tanks were the bare aluminum bottoms of the tanks, with a thin film of residue on them. And that was all. The gauges on the dash, which I went back to and looked at, still showed more than half on both tanks. The gauges on the dash were lying. The gauges on the dash had been lying since at least the morning, because there had been no place between the marina and the wreck where 240 gallons of diesel could have gone. And we had not used 240 gallons running out to the wreck. We had used maybe 60, and we should have had 180 gallons in the tanks at the moment the engines died, and instead we had none. My grandfather sat down on the cooler. He sat down slowly. He sat down the way a man sits down when his knees have stopped trusting him. He put his hands on his thighs, and he looked at the deck between his feet for a long moment. And then he looked up at me, and he said, in the voice he used for talking to me, "Do not panic." He said it not because I was panicking, but because he could see that I was about to. I want to give him credit for that. He saw it before I did. He said it before I had to be the one to say it. He said, "Do not panic." He said, "The radio still works." He said, "We have water." He said, "We are not going anywhere, but we are not in any immediate danger, and the radio works, and someone will come." He got up. He went back to the helm. He keyed the radio. He said, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is the vessel name and documentation number. Position such and such, both engines out of fuel. Request assistance. Over." He used the word Mayday because he had been told for 30 years that the word Mayday was reserved for actual emergencies and not to be used lightly. And he had decided that being adrift 42 miles offshore with no fuel and a strange voice on the radio telling him to return to port was an actual emergency. He keyed the mic. He waited. The carrier hiss was there. No one answered. He waited. The carrier hiss was there. No one answered. He said the Mayday again. He gave the position again. He keyed the mic. He waited. The carrier hiss was there. No one answered. He sat down at the helm. He looked at me. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that was different from the voice he had been using a minute earlier, in a voice that was tired and that was also a little angry, although the anger was not at me, he said, "The radio is working." I keyed it. The squelch broke. The carrier dropped at the end of the transmission the way it is supposed to drop. The radio is working. They are not answering. He said, they being whoever it had been on the radio half an hour earlier, the two voices that had told us about the hazard advisory and that had told us to return to port. He said it the way a man says a thing he has been thinking but has not been ready to say. They are not answering. I looked at the southwest horizon. The band of strange color on the southwest horizon had moved. It had moved closer. It was now a wide band of dirty air that took up about the lower third of the southwest sky. And the upper edge of it was higher than the lower edge had been an hour ago. And the color of it was not the color of smoke, and was not the color of a storm. It was the color of something I did not have a name for. The sun, which had been a clear yellow at 5:15, was now a faint orange, even though the sun itself was nowhere near the band. The light on the deck of the boat was wrong. The light was the wrong color. The shadows of the rods in their holders fell on the deck in a way that was not the way they should fall in late afternoon light in August. The wind, I noticed then, had stopped. The wind had been 5 to 7 knots out of the southeast for the entire day. The wind had been the wind. The wind was now nothing. The surface of the water around the boat was glass. The small swell that had been rocking the boat was still there. The slow, long swell that comes from somewhere far away. But the small chop on top of the swell, the small wind ripple that had been there all day, and that I had not noticed because I had never been on this water when it was not there, was gone. The water was the color of mercury. The boat sat on it. My grandfather and I sat on the boat and looked at the band of strange color on the southwest horizon. And I started to understand. In the slow way that a 17-year-old understands a thing that is too big for him. That the voice on the radio that had told us to return to port had told us to return to port not because someone wanted us out of the area, but because someone had wanted to know if we would respond. And that when my grandfather had responded by trying to return to port, the engines had died. And that the engines had died because someone had drained our fuel, or because the gauges had been lying to us for longer than today, and we had run out 200 miles ahead of where we should have, or because something else had happened that I did not yet have a frame for, and that the radio that was working was not bringing us anyone, and that the band of strange color on the southwest horizon was getting closer, and that we were 42 nautical miles from land with no engines, and no answer on the radio, and a horizon that was the wrong color, and a sea that had no wind on it. My grandfather stood up from the helm. He went to the cuddy cabin. He came back with a paper chart, the kind he had carried for 30 years, even after the chart plotter became reliable, because he had not trusted any electronic to be the only copy of where he was. He spread the chart on the engine hatch. He put his finger on our position. He drew a small line with the pencil he kept clipped to the chart from our position to the marina. He measured the line against the scale at the bottom of the chart. He said, 42 nautical miles. He said in a current of about half a knot to the north, with the wind dropping like this, we are going to drift slowly to the north. He said, if we drift for 24 hours, we are going to be about 12 nautical miles north of where we are now, and about 48 from the marina. He said the closest shore to our current position is east, about 35 nautical miles. He said, we are not going to row that. He said, we are not going to swim that. He said, we are going to sit here and wait. And we are going to keep trying the radio. And we are going to ration the water. And someone is going to come. I said, okay. He said, I want you to do something for me. I said, okay. He said, I want you to go into the cuddy cabin and get my logbook from the dry box and bring it up here. I want you to open it to today's date, and I want you to write down everything that has happened since 5:15 this afternoon. The first broadcast, the second broadcast, the order to return to port, the engines dying, the fuel tanks being empty when the gauges said half, the wind dropping, the color of the horizon, the time of each of these things, as best you can remember. I want it in your handwriting, and I want it dated, and I want it signed by both of us at the bottom. I said, why? He looked at me. He said, because I want a record of what happened that is not on the chart plotter and not on the radio and not in my head. He said, in case something happens to one of us, He said it without dressing it up. He said it the way he had told me 4 years ago, that my grandmother had died, which was by sitting me down at this kitchen table and saying the words, and waiting for me to be ready for the next thing. I went into the cuddy cabin. I got the logbook from the dry box. I came back up to the deck. I sat down on the cooler. I opened the logbook to today's date. I clicked the pen. I started to write. I wrote down the times and the things in the order he had said them. My handwriting was not steady. I want to tell you that it was, because I've been writing about my grandfather like he was a steady man, and I would like to be a steady boy. It was not. The letters on the page leaned. The numbers were small and crowded. I wrote down the first broadcast and the second broadcast, and the order to return to port, and the engines dying, and the fuel tanks, and the wind, and the color. And when I got to the color, I stopped, because I did not have a word for it. And I sat with the pen above the page, and I looked at the southwest horizon. And the band of strange color was closer than it had been 5 minutes earlier. It was closing on us. It was closing not with the speed of a storm, but with the steadiness of something that was not subject to the wind, because the wind was not doing anything. It was approaching the boat. It was coming to us. My grandfather was at the helm. He had picked up the mic again. He was about to key it. He stopped. He held the mic in his hand, and he looked at the water off the port bow, and he said very quietly, "Cole, look. Cole is my name. I had not told you that. It is Cole. I am telling you now because of the way my grandfather said it on the deck of the boat at 6:20 in the evening on the second Tuesday of August, when he said my name in a voice I had not heard him use in 9 years of fishing with him. And I want the name on the page when you hear that voice." I looked at the water off the port bow, the mercury water, the water with no wind on it. There were footprints on the water. I want to tell you what I'm about to tell you carefully, because I've been over and over it in my head in the days since, and I'm trying to be precise. There were 2 footprints on the surface of the water off the port bow of the boat. They were the shape of bare human feet, a left foot and a right foot. Side by side, the kind of footprints a person leaves on a wet beach when they are standing still. They were on the surface of the water. They were depressions in the mercury, 2 foot-shaped depressions, the way a footprint is a depression in sand. They were not floating objects. They were not shadows. They were prints. The water around them was flat and undisturbed, and the prints themselves held their shape, did not fill in, did not move with the slow swell, did not waver, did not dissipate. They were about 6 feet off the port bow. They were facing the boat. I looked at them. I looked at my grandfather. He was looking at them. He was not moving. He had the mic in his hand, and he had not put it down. His face was doing a thing I had not seen his face do. I looked back at the water. The footprints were still there. A second pair of footprints appeared on the water about 4 feet behind the first pair. They appeared without anything making them. The mercury's surface did not ripple. There was no splash. There was no sound. The second pair appeared and held. And then a third pair appeared 4 feet behind that. And a fourth pair 4 feet behind that. And the footprints went in a line away from the boat, back toward the southwest, toward the band of dirty air. In a steady walking trail, 2 by 2, left and right. The kind of trail a person leaves walking away. The trail extended out from the boat across the flat water for what I would say was 100 feet, although I'm not sure. The trail extended until the footprints became too small to see, and the last ones I could see were still steady and clean. And the trail did not stop or turn. It just went past where my eyes could follow it, in the direction of the dirty band, which was now noticeably closer than it had been when I had first looked at the footprints. My grandfather, on the deck behind me, said in the same quiet voice, "Cole, get in the cabin." I did not move. He said, "Cole, get in the cabin. Close the hatch. Do it now." I started to move. I want to tell you I moved quickly. I did not. I moved slowly, the way you move in a dream, because my legs had stopped trusting me, the way his knees had stopped trusting him an hour ago. I took 2 steps toward the cuddy cabin. I looked back at the water. The trail of footprints was still there. The first pair, the one closest to the boat, was still 6 feet off the port bow, facing the boat. The closest pair had not moved with the trail. The closest pair was looking at us. The closest pair, I saw then, was wet. I do not know how to explain to you what I mean by that. The whole surface of the water was wet. Water is wet. That is what water is. The footprints in the water were depressions in the wet surface of the water. The closest pair of footprints, the pair facing the boat, was wet in a different way. The depressions of the closest pair held a small bright shine on the surface, the kind of shine fresh water has on a hot deck for the few seconds before it dries. And the shine was on top of the water, and the shine had a quality that the rest of the mercury surface did not have. And I understood, looking at it, that the closest pair of footprints was not where someone had walked away from the boat. The closest pair of footprints was where someone had walked toward the boat. And the wetness of those prints was the wetness of a foot that had just lifted off the surface and stepped up onto something. The trail did not lead away from the boat. The trail led to the boat. The last pair of footprints, the wet ones, were the place where the feet had stopped being on the water and had started being somewhere else. And the somewhere else had to be on the deck, because there was nowhere else for the feet to go. And the deck of the boat was 42 nautical miles from land in the open Gulf at 6:22 on a Tuesday evening in August, with the wind dead and the engines dry and the radio silent. And my grandfather was on the deck behind me, and he had told me to get in the cabin. And I had not moved fast enough. And the wet footprints on the water were facing the boat, and I was still on the deck, and so was he. I got into the cabin. I did it slow, the way I've already told you, and I am not going to make myself sound braver about it than I was. I went down the 2 steps into the cuddy, and I pulled the small hatch closed behind me. And the hatch on the cuddy is a thin piece of fiberglass with a plastic latch on it that a child could break. And I latched it anyway, because my grandfather had told me to close the hatch, and I closed the hatch. And that is the thing I want you to keep in your head while I tell you the rest of this. He told me to close the hatch. I closed the hatch. He was on the deck. I was in the cabin. The hatch was between us. The cuddy on his boat is not a cabin the way a sailboat has a cabin. It is a hole forward of the helm with a V-berth across the front, a small folding table in the middle, the dry box mounted to the bulkhead on the starboard side, a small porthole on each side, and the head behind a curtain at the back. The portholes are the kind of round, small windows that you cannot really see out of, because they are scratched from 12 years of being open and closed and being splashed and being wiped down with the wrong kind of rag. You can see light through them. You can see whether it is day or night. You cannot see what is on the deck of your boat through them. I sat down on the edge of the V-berth. I did not sit down because I had decided to sit down. I sat down because my legs did the thing my grandfather's knees had done an hour earlier, and they stopped holding me. And the V-berth was where I happened to land. The cuddy was dim. The cuddy was always dim. It was the color of inside a boat that had not been aired out properly in 12 years. The smell was the smell I had known since I was 12. Diesel, and the kind of mildew that lives in the corners of fiberglass, and the old foam of the V-berth cushions, and my grandfather's coffee, which had soaked into the upholstery over 30 years of being spilled there. and which had become part of the boat. I waited for the boat to do something. The boat did not do anything. The hull did not rock. The hull did not list. The hull did not move at all, which was wrong, because even on a flat sea, a boat at anchor or adrift rocks with a slow, long swell, and the slow, long swell had been there a minute ago. And now, sitting in the cuddy with my hand against the hull, I could feel that the boat was not moving. The boat was sitting on the water the way a thing sits on a table. It was not floating. It was sitting. I do not know how else to say it. I waited for my grandfather to say something. He did not say anything. The deck above me was the deck. I could hear, through the hatch, the small, constant sounds I'd been hearing all day. The rods in their holders, the small flap of the boat flag on the antenna mount, the small tick of the chart plotter in its mount. The wind had been nothing for several minutes by then, and the flag should not have been moving, but the flag was making the small sound it made when it moved, which meant it was moving, even though the wind was nothing. I do not know what to do with that. I am putting it down because I noticed it. I sat for what I think was about a minute. The pen I'd been writing the log with was on the small folding table in front of me, where I'd set it down before I'd come into the cabin. The logbook was on the cooler outside, where I had left it open. I had not finished the entry. I had stopped at the color. I had not signed it. I had not had my grandfather sign it. I want to tell you what I felt at that moment, because I think it matters to what came after. I felt the small bad feeling that I had felt all day. The feeling that had started when I had seen the band of strange color and had been confirmed when the radio had spoken without identifying itself, and had been confirmed again when the engines had died, and had been confirmed again when the fuel tanks had been dry. The bad feeling was now the only feeling I had. The bad feeling had filled up the whole inside of my chest, and there was nothing else in it. And in the middle of the bad feeling, I noticed, with a small, clean clarity that I did not deserve, that I was inside the cabin, and that my grandfather was outside the cabin, and that he had put me inside the cabin, and that he had stayed outside the cabin, and that the way he had said my name on the deck had been a way of saying my name that I had not heard him use in 9 years of fishing with him. I knew, sitting in the cuddy, what he had done. He had not put me in the cabin to keep me safe from something that was about to happen. The cabin was a fiberglass box with a plastic latch on a door that a child could break. The cabin would not keep me safe from anything that wanted to come into the cabin. He had put me in the cabin to keep me from seeing whatever was about to happen on the deck. He had decided that whatever was about to happen on the deck was a thing that should happen to him and not to me. And he had moved me out of sight of it, and he had stayed where it was. That was the calculation he had made. The calculation had taken him about 3 seconds. I had taken about 30 seconds to obey it. I had not understood the calculation while I was obeying it. I understood it sitting on the V-berth with the bad feeling in my chest. And by then, the calculation had been made, and the hatch was closed. And I was inside the cabin, and he was outside the cabin. And there was no version of the next minute in which I could undo it. I want to tell you what I should have done. I want to be honest. I should have opened the hatch. I should have gone back up onto the deck. And I should have stood next to my grandfather. And I should have said whatever I needed to say to be on the deck with him. I am 17 and he is 68, and I am the one with 2 good knees and the one with a lifetime of summers ahead of me. And the calculation he had made was that he would take what was coming for the boat. And I should not have let him make that calculation alone. I should have refused it. That is what a different boy would have done. And that is what I want to put down here, because if I am going to put down everything else, I am going to put down that. A different boy would have opened the hatch. I did not. I sat on the V-berth and I held my hands flat on my knees and I waited for the sound on the deck above me, and I did not move. The sound on the deck above me was a footstep. I want to be careful. I want to tell you what I heard, not what I have decided I heard. I heard a single footstep on the foredeck. The foredeck is the area forward of the windshield. The part you walk on to handle the anchor, the part above the cuddy cabin. The foredeck is fiberglass, with a textured non-skid surface that has been worn smooth in the places where my grandfather and I have walked on it most often. A footstep on the foredeck makes a particular sound, which is the sound of a soft-soled shoe on the textured fiberglass, with a small hollow note, because the cuddy under the foredeck is empty space and acts as a resonator. The footstep I heard was a single bare foot on the foredeck, which makes a slightly different sound, slightly wetter, slightly flatter. The footstep was directly above my head. The boat shifted slightly, the way a boat shifts when a person's weight steps onto it. I felt the shift. I had not been imagining the boat sitting on the water. The boat had been sitting on the water. The boat had been sitting on the water, and now the boat was floating again, the way it should have been floating all afternoon. And the difference between sitting and floating, I could feel under my feet through the fiberglass of the cuddy floor. The boat had been held still. It was no longer being held still. Something had stepped onto the foredeck, and the holding had stopped, the way a person who is holding a thing in place lets go of it when they have what they came for. There was a second footstep. This one was at the bow rail. Then a third on the small platform forward of the windshield where the anchor windlass sits. Then the sound of a body, a soft, small sound of a body stepping down from the foredeck into the cockpit. The cockpit is where my grandfather was. I heard my grandfather say something. I do not know what he said. The hatch and the bulkhead between us made his voice a mumble. He was speaking. I could hear the rhythm of his voice. It was the rhythm of his normal voice, the rhythm he used to give a charter the safety talk at the beginning of a trip. It was a long, calm rhythm. It was not a rhythm of fear, and it was not a rhythm of pleading. He was talking to whatever was on the deck, and he was talking to it in the voice he used to talk to anyone who was on his boat. He had decided to talk to it. There was no answer. Whatever was on the deck did not have a voice or did not use one. There was no second voice. There was only my grandfather's voice, going on in the long, calm rhythm, with small pauses in it the way his speech had pauses in it. I sat on the V-berth and I listened to my grandfather talk to the thing on his deck. He talked to it for what I would say was 3 minutes, maybe 4, I do not know. The pauses were in the way I've always heard him pause. He would say a thing, and then he would stop, the way he stopped when he was waiting for the other person to respond. And then when no response came, he would say the next thing. He did this for 3 or 4 minutes. He never raised his voice. He never sounded afraid. He sounded the way he sounded when he was telling a guest, gently, that the regulations on this water did not allow you to keep that fish, and that the fish was going to have to go back, and that the trip was not over. There were other fish. Please put it back in the water, sir. Thank you. Then he stopped talking. There was a pause, not the small pause of waiting for a response. A longer pause. The boat shifted again, slightly, the way a boat shifts when a person's weight moves across the cockpit. Then my grandfather said, in a voice that was loud enough for me to hear clearly through the hatch, "Cole, do not open this hatch. Do not come out here. Whatever you hear, whatever happens, do not open this hatch." He said it 3 times. "Cole, do not open this hatch. Cole, do not open this hatch. Cole, do not open this hatch." He said it 3 times, and his voice was steady all 3 times, and he stopped. And the deck above me was quiet. And after a few seconds, the boat shifted again. The way a boat shifts when a person's weight moves across the cockpit and then off the boat. And then I did not hear anything else from the deck for what I'm going to call a long time. Although I do not know how long it was, because the way time moved inside the cuddy, with the bad feeling in my chest, was not the way time moved on the dash clock at the helm. I do not know exactly when I understood that my grandfather was no longer on the boat. I want to be honest about that too. I think I understood it in stages. The first stage was when the second shift happened, the shift that felt like a weight leaving the boat. The second stage was when no more sounds came from the deck for a minute. The third stage was when I called his name very quietly against the hatch, with my mouth almost against the fiberglass, and he did not answer. The fourth stage was when I called his name a little louder, and he did not answer. The fifth stage was when I lifted the hatch about an inch, which I had told myself I would not do. And I looked out at the cockpit through the inch of opening, and the cockpit was empty. The fishing rods were in their holders. The cooler was where I had been sitting on it an hour earlier. The logbook was on the cooler, open, with the pen lying across it where I had set the pen down. My grandfather's hat was on the helm seat. His sunglasses were on the dashboard. His coffee thermos was on the small ledge by the wheel. The chart he had spread on the engine hatch was still there, with a pencil line he had drawn on it and the marina marked with a small X. His radio mic was hanging on the bracket where it lived when it was not in his hand. He was not in the cockpit. He was not on the foredeck. I could not see the foredeck from the inch of opening, but I knew the way he stood and the sound he made standing. And there was no sound from the foredeck. I lifted the hatch a little farther. The cockpit was still empty. I lifted the hatch all the way. The cockpit was empty. I stepped up out of the cuddy onto the deck. The foredeck was empty. The fly bridge above the hardtop was empty. The water around the boat was empty. There was no boat alongside us. There was no swimmer in the water. There was no person on the boat except me. I want to tell you what was on the deck. The deck of the cockpit was wet. It was wet the way a deck gets wet when someone has walked across it with wet feet. There was a trail of wet footprints on the cockpit deck, 2 by 2, left and right, going from the bow rail to the place where the small swim ladder hung off the transom on the port side. The trail was the same trail that had been on the water. It led across the boat. The last pair of footprints, the wet ones, were at the top of the swim ladder, facing the water, the way the prints face when a person has stopped at the edge of a deck before stepping off it. There was no third trail. There was no fourth trail. There was the trail that had walked onto the boat from the water, and there was a small smear in the middle of the cockpit where my grandfather had been standing. The smear of his deck shoes, which were the deck shoes he had been wearing all day, and the trail of wet, bare footprints had walked across the deck from the foredeck to the place where the smear was. And from the place where the smear was, the trail had continued. But now the trail was no longer just wet, bare footprints. From the place where the smear was, the wet, bare footprints continued to the swim ladder. And beside them, half in and half out of the wet trail, were the prints of my grandfather's deck shoes, going in the same direction, walking with the wet feet, walking with them to the ladder, and stopping at the ladder side by side. His deck shoes were not on the boat anymore. He had walked off the boat in them. He had walked off the boat with whatever had walked onto it, in his shoes, beside it, in step. I want to tell you that I knew, looking at the prints, exactly what had happened. I do not. I am telling you what I saw on the deck of the boat. I saw the prints of my grandfather's shoes leaving the boat next to the prints of bare feet. The prints of bare feet had come onto the boat alone. The prints of bare feet had left the boat with my grandfather. He had gone with them. He had gone over the swim ladder onto the water. The water beside the boat was empty. There was no trail on the water beside the boat that I could see. The thing about the trail on the water, on the way in, was that the prints had held. The thing about the trail on the way out, whatever way out there had been, was that there were no prints. The water beside the boat had nothing on it. I stood in the cockpit for a long time. I think it was a long time. The sun was lower than it had been when I had gone into the cuddy. The band of strange color on the southwest horizon was closer than it had been, and it was now wider, and it was now visible as a kind of haze in the air above the water, not just on the horizon. The light on the deck was wrong in a way that was now distinct enough that I could name it. The light was the color of the inside of an orange. The shadows on the deck were the wrong length for the angle of the sun. I did the thing my grandfather would have done. I want to put that down. I did the thing he would have done, not because I was being brave, but because I did not know what else to do, and because the thing he would have done was the only set of motions I had practiced in 9 years of summers, and my hands found the motions on their own. I went to the helm. I keyed the radio. I said, "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is the vessel name and documentation number, position such and such. My grandfather has gone overboard, and I'm alone on the boat. Request immediate assistance. Over." I gave the position from the chart plotter, which was still showing a position, although the position it was showing was not exactly the position I'd read on the chart an hour earlier, and was about half a nautical mile to the southwest of where my grandfather had marked our position on the paper chart, which meant either the boat had drifted half a mile to the southwest with no wind and a north-setting current, which was not possible, or the chart plotter was lying. I gave the position the chart plotter showed. I let off the mic. I listened. The carrier hiss was there. No one answered. I said the Mayday again. I said it in the voice I had heard my grandfather use 1,000 times for routine traffic. I said it without crying, although by that point I was crying. The crying was not in my voice. The crying was on my face. I kept it off the radio. I said it 10 times. I said it in 3 different ways. I said it on channel 16, and then on channel 22 alpha, and then on channel 9, and then back on channel 16. I gave the position. I asked for the Coast Guard. I asked for any vessel. I asked for any station. The carrier hiss was there each time. No one answered. At some point, I noticed that the carrier hiss itself had changed. The carrier hiss is the small, even noise that a radio gives when the channel is open. The carrier hiss had been even all day. Now the carrier hiss had a small, slow wavering in it, the way a radio sounds when the squelch is set wrong, or when there is interference. The wavering was at the edge of the noise. I would not have noticed it if I had not been listening for any response, with the kind of attention you give to silence when you need it to speak. The wavering was rhythmic. It was a slow on-off, like a thing breathing. I listened to it for a while. It was not breathing. Radios do not breathe. The wavering was the wavering of an electronic interference at a regular frequency. And the regular frequency was about 1 cycle every 2 seconds, which is about the rate at which a person walks. I turned the radio off. I sat down on the helm seat. I picked up my grandfather's hat from where it was sitting on the seat. I held it on my lap. The hat was a faded blue cap with the boat's name on the front and the small white stain on the brim where he had spilled coffee on it 10 years ago. I held the hat. I want to tell you that I was thinking about him, and that I was praying for him, and that I was trying to make a plan, and I want that to be true. I was not thinking about anything. I was holding the hat. The hat was warm from being in the sun. I held it. I sat with the hat for what was probably 20 minutes. I am estimating. I do not remember. The sun moved lower. The band of color got closer. The light on the deck got worse. The boat did not move, because the wind was still nothing, and the engines were still dead. And the current was either doing what the chart plotter said it was doing, or doing what the paper chart had predicted it should be doing. And either way, the boat was not getting any closer to land. At some point, I got up. I want to tell you what I did, and I want to do it in order. I got up from the helm seat, and I put the hat on. I did not put it on because I was claiming his hat. I put it on because the sun was in my eyes, and his hat had a brim, and my head was bare, and the brim helped. I went to the engine hatch. I lifted it. The engines were still the engines. The fuel filters were still empty. I closed the hatch. I went to the tank inspection ports. I unscrewed the main tank port. I looked in. The tank was empty. I closed the port. I went to the cuddy. I went down into the cuddy. I opened the dry box. I took out the small flare gun, which was a plastic orange pistol, and the box of flares, which had 4 flares in it. I took out the small handheld VHF radio, which was a backup radio my grandfather kept charged on a small charger that ran off the house batteries. I took out the satellite messenger, which was a small orange device that he had bought 2 years ago, and that he had told me the day he bought it was for emergencies that the regular radio could not handle, and that I should know how to use it in case he was not around, and that he had then taught me how to use it on the kitchen table of this house, by walking me through the menu and the message functions and the SOS button. The satellite messenger had a button on the front that said SOS. The button was under a small protective cover. You had to flip the cover up and then press and hold the button for 3 seconds, and then a light would blink, and the device would send a distress message to a service that would then notify the appropriate emergency authorities. He had told me, when he was teaching me, that you only pressed the button when you meant it. He had told me that the button was the last thing. I sat with the satellite messenger on the V-berth in the cuddy. I held the button cover open with my thumb. I looked at the button. I want to tell you what I was thinking, and I am going to try. I was thinking that the radio had not brought anyone. The radio had been working, and the radio had not brought anyone, and the radio had carried 2 broadcasts that had not been Coast Guard, and the radio had a wavering carrier that was at the rate of a person walking. I was thinking that the satellite messenger was a different system. The satellite messenger went up to a satellite. The satellite was outside whatever was happening on this water. The satellite would send a message to a service, and the service would call the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard would send a helicopter or a boat to my position. I was thinking that this would work. I was also thinking about the voice that had told us to return to port. The voice had said, "Return to port." That was all the voice had said. The voice had not been the Coast Guard. The voice had been someone. Someone had been on the radio, on a Coast Guard channel, in the cadence of a Coast Guard broadcast, telling boats to return to port. Someone had been on the radio when no one else was on the radio. Someone had been operating something that could put a voice on a Coast Guard channel from a position that was apparently not on land, because no land transmitter would reach this far out reliably, which meant the voice had been on a vessel. And the vessel had been close enough to us to put a voice on the radio at the strength we had heard it. And the vessel had not appeared on the horizon. And the vessel had not appeared on the radar because my grandfather had radar, and had it on. And the radar had not picked up anything within 10 miles of us all afternoon. I was thinking that whoever had been on the radio had been close enough to drain our fuel. I was thinking that whoever had been on the radio had wanted us to try to return to port, and had wanted us to fail, and had wanted us to stop here, exactly here, at 6 in the evening on a Tuesday in August, exactly 42 nautical miles offshore, exactly where we had been when the band of color had been on the southwestern horizon, and where the band of color was now closing on us, and that the trip out to this position had not been our trip. It had been a route someone else had wanted us to run, and that the wreck my grandfather had been fishing for 30 years had been the place someone else had wanted us to stop. And I want to tell you that I do not know any of this for certain. I'm telling you what I was thinking. Sitting on the V berth with the satellite messenger in my hand, and the button cover open and my thumb above the button, I was thinking that if I pressed the button, a message would go up to a satellite, and the satellite would tell a service, and the service would tell the Coast Guard, and the Coast Guard would dispatch a helicopter or a boat, and the helicopter or the boat would be the Coast Guard, or it would not be the Coast Guard. I was thinking that the only voices that had answered the radio so far had not been the Coast Guard. I was thinking that if I pressed the button and a vessel came to my position, I did not know how I was going to tell. When it came, whether the vessel that came was a real Coast Guard vessel or a vessel that was going to come because I had told it where I was. I was thinking that my grandfather had not pressed the button. He had had the satellite messenger in the dry box. He had told me about the button. He had said, "You only press the button when you mean it." He had had 3 hours between the moment the engines died and the moment he stepped off the boat. And he had not pressed the button. He had used the regular radio, which had not brought help. He had not used the messenger. He had had time. He had not used it. I sat with the messenger in my hand for a long time. I do not know how long. I want to tell you that I was making a moral calculation about whether to press the button. I was not. I was sitting with the messenger in my hand because the act of sitting with it was the only thing I had decided to do. And I had not yet decided to do the next thing. The next thing was either to press the button or to not press the button. I could not see how to decide. I thought about my grandfather, who had not pressed the button. I thought about the helicopter that might come. I thought about whether the helicopter that might come would be the Coast Guard. I thought about the fact that I was 17, and that I had been on a boat alone for the first time in my life for about 40 minutes, and that I did not know how to make this decision, and that my grandfather had not made it for me. I want to tell you the choice I made. I did not press the button. I closed the cover over the button. I put the messenger back in the dry box. I closed the dry box. I went up onto the deck. I want to be honest about why I did not press the button. I have spent the days since trying to be honest about it, and I'm going to try now. I did not press the button because my grandfather had not pressed it. I did not press the button because I was afraid that the thing that came when I pressed it would not be the Coast Guard, and that whatever it was would come to my position because I had told it where I was, and that being adrift with no engines and no fuel for a long time was a better outcome than being found by the wrong vessel within the next 2 hours. I did not press the button because I had watched my grandfather walk off the boat with something that had walked onto it on the surface of the water, and I had not understood what I had watched, and I did not want to make any more invitations. That is what I want to say. But I want to put down also the thing that is harder to say. I did not press the button because pressing the button would have meant deciding. Pressing the button would have meant choosing the outcome. And I have spent my whole life letting my grandfather choose the outcome. And I could not, in that hour, on the V-berth in the cuddy with the messenger in my hand, become the kind of person who made the choice. I sat with the messenger, and I did not press the button, because not pressing the button was the same thing as not making the choice. And not making the choice was what I had been trained, for 17 years, to do. He had not pressed the button. So I did not press the button. That is the answer. I did not press the button because he had not. I am putting it down because I think it is the truth. I sat on the deck of the boat with the hat on my head and the rods in their holders and the cooler in front of me and the logbook open on top of the cooler. I picked up the pen. I finished the entry. I wrote down the time my grandfather had gone off the boat, which was 6:24, give or take a minute. I wrote down the footprints. I wrote down what I had heard him say through the hatch, which was the 3 repetitions of, "Do not open this hatch." I wrote down the empty cockpit. I wrote down the wet trail to the swim ladder. I wrote down the smear of his shoes beside the wet feet at the ladder. I wrote down the fact that I had not pressed the button. I signed it. I dated it. There was no one to countersign it. I put the logbook in the dry box. I closed the dry box. I sat at the helm. The night came. I want to tell you about the night, because the night was a long thing. And most of what is in me now came in during the night. The band of strange color on the southwestern horizon reached the boat about an hour after sunset. It did not arrive the way weather arrives. It arrived the way a tide rises, slowly, with no edge, with the air around the boat just gradually becoming the air that the band had been from a distance. The same dirty color, the same wrong quality of light. Except that there was no light now because the sun was down. The air at night was warm and still, and it had a small dry taste in it. The taste of the inside of an empty terracotta pot. And the stars above were not the stars I knew. I want to be careful. The stars were where the stars were supposed to be. I could see Polaris off the bow. I could see the summer triangle overhead. The constellations were correct. There were more stars than there were supposed to be. The space between the constellations was full of small, dim stars that were not on any chart I had ever looked at. The way the sky looks if you go up into a mountain on a clear night. Except that I was at sea level and at sea. And the sky over the Gulf in August does not have the high mountain stars in it. The sky had the high mountain stars in it. The sky also had a small, slow movement in it that I could not place, a faint suggestion that some of the stars were moving in patterns that the stars should not have been moving in. I want to be careful about that too. I am writing what I saw. I am not telling you the stars were moving. I am telling you that some of them looked to me, sitting in the helm seat of my grandfather's boat with my grandfather's hat on, like they were doing a thing they should not have been doing. The boat was quiet. Nothing came on the deck. Nothing came up the swim ladder. The radio I had turned off stayed off. The carrier with its wavering was not a thing I had to listen to. The water around the boat was glass. At some point, in the dark, I heard the engines. I heard them from a long way away. They came from the southwest, from inside the band, which had now been at the boat for hours and had spread out to the north and east so that I could not tell where the band ended and the rest of the world began. The engines were diesels. They were big diesels. They were the kind of engines that a vessel of significant size carries. The engines came across the water from the southwest at the pace of a vessel underway at maybe 10 knots. I heard them grow louder, slowly, over the course of what was probably 20 minutes until they were near. I went to the helm. I turned on the running lights, and then I turned them off again. I do not know why I turned them on, and I do not know why I turned them off. I turned them off, and I sat in the dark, and I listened. The vessel passed by the boat. It did not stop. I did not see it. The night was as dark as I've ever seen a night, and the band in the air had taken away the small reflected light that even a dark night usually has. And the vessel passed within what I would say was a quarter of a mile of where my grandfather's boat was sitting, going from southwest to northeast, with its engines at a steady 10 knots. And the engines passed and faded and were gone, and I did not see it, and it did not see me, or it did see me and chose not to stop. I sat in the dark with my grandfather's hat on. I want to tell you what I thought. I thought that the vessel that had passed had been a vessel, and that there were vessels out here, and that vessels were going somewhere through this water at night with their lights off. And I thought about the voice that had said return to port, and about the voice that had said hazard advisory. And I thought about the fact that someone had drained our fuel, and I thought, for the first time in the day, that whatever had happened to the boat was a thing that someone had done, and that whatever had happened to my grandfather was a thing that had happened, and that the thing that had happened to my grandfather was not necessarily the same thing as the thing that someone had done to the boat. They might be the same. They might not be. I do not know. The morning came. I want to tell you about the morning briefly because the morning is the last thing I want to write about, and I do not want to spend a long time at it. The band of color was gone by sunrise. The air over the water was the air it was supposed to be in August. The sun came up clean. The wind came back at about 2 in the morning, a soft wind from the southeast. And by sunrise, it was the 5 to 7 knots that had been there the day before. And the small chop was back on the water. And the boat was rocking the way it should have been rocking. The water around the boat was empty. There were no footprints anywhere. There was a small wet patch on the cockpit deck near the swim ladder where the trail had been, and the wet patch was drying in the morning sun. I turned the radio on. The carrier was clean. No wavering. I keyed the mic. I said the Mayday. I gave my position from the chart plotter, which was now showing a position that matched what the paper chart predicted my drift would have been overnight. 12 nautical miles north of where I'd been at sunset, just as my grandfather had said. I said it twice. A voice answered. The voice was a man, and the voice identified itself with a call sign that I recognized. And the voice said the name of the Coast Guard station that I had grown up knowing. And the voice told me that a helicopter was being dispatched and that I should remain at my position and that everything was going to be all right. I want to tell you that I cried at the voice. I did not. I said thank you. I said my position again. I said the documentation number of the boat. I said the name of my grandfather. I said that he had gone overboard the previous evening at approximately 6:24. I said that we had been adrift since approximately 5:30 due to fuel exhaustion of unknown cause. I said all of this in the voice my grandfather had taught me to use on a radio. The voice on the other end said that a helicopter was on the way. The voice did not ask me how my grandfather had gone overboard. The voice did not ask me what I meant by fuel exhaustion of unknown cause. The voice told me to stand by. The helicopter came in about 2 hours. It was a Coast Guard helicopter. The crew was a Coast Guard crew. They asked me the questions Coast Guard crews ask. They took the boat under tow with a different boat that came out behind the helicopter. They got me to a dock and to a hospital and to a deputy sheriff, in that order. And I gave the deputy sheriff the same statement I'm giving you, with all the parts about footprints and bands of color and walking on the water taken out because I am 17. And the deputy sheriff was not going to write down a statement that had those things in it. And I had decided, somewhere between the helicopter and the dock, that the version of the story that other people would be willing to hear was a version where my grandfather had gone overboard for reasons that were not clear, and where the boat had run out of fuel for reasons that were not clear, and where the rest of it was not in the official record. I gave them that version. They wrote it down. They were kind to me. The deputy sheriff in particular was kind to me. And he sat with me in the small office at the marina for almost an hour while I waited for my mother to drive down from the city to get me. And he did not push me to add anything to what I had said. And I want to tell him, although I will not, that I am sorry I lied to him. My grandfather has not been found. I want to put that down. The Coast Guard searched for 2 days. They searched along the drift line that the boat would have followed from the position my grandfather had marked on the paper chart, and they searched east of that and west of that, and they did not find anything. There was no body in the water. There was no debris. There was no sign of him. The boat is at the marina. I will probably sell it. I do not know. I am writing this on the green vinyl couch in the front room of his house, which is now my house. Because he had no other living family. Because my grandmother is dead. Because my mother is his daughter. And she does not want this house. And she has told me, by phone, that the house is mine if I want it, and that she will sign whatever needs to be signed when I turn 18 in November, and that until then I can stay here, and that she will come down every weekend to check on me. She came down last weekend. She came down the weekend before. She is a kind woman who did not know my grandfather well, and she does not know how to be in this house with me. And we sit at the kitchen table, and we eat the food she has brought, and we do not talk about him. And she goes home on Sunday evening, and I'm alone in the house again. The reason I'm writing this on the back of charter receipts is because I do not want it to look like a thing that anyone has prepared. I want it to look like the thing it is, which is a boy on a couch with a pen and the only paper he could find. I am going to put this in the dry box on the boat when I am done with it. I am going to leave it there. I do not know who is going to find it. Maybe no one. Maybe whoever buys the boat. Maybe someone who knows what to do with it. Maybe my grandfather, although I am writing that down, knowing it is not a thing that is going to happen. And writing it down anyway because the act of writing it down is in some way I cannot say cleanly. A thing I needed to do. I want to tell you the last thing. 2 nights ago, I was sitting on the back porch of this house, which faces the small canal that runs behind the houses on this street and that connects, through 3 other canals and a small bay, to the Gulf. I was sitting on the porch because the house was hot and the porch was cooler. I had the porch light off. I was not drinking anything. I was sitting. It was about 11 at night. I heard from the canal the small sound of water. Not the sound of a boat. Not the sound of a fish. The sound of water moving the way it moves when a person walks through it. I did not look. I want you to understand that. I sat on the porch in the dark, and I heard the sound of water moving along the canal behind the house. And I did not look down at the canal. I do not know what was in the canal. I do not know if anything was in the canal. I sat on the porch with my hands flat on my knees, and I waited for the sound to pass, the way I had waited for sounds to pass through the hatch of the cuddy. And after a few minutes, the sound passed, and the canal was quiet. And after a few more minutes, I went inside the house, and I locked the back door, and I went to bed. And I did not sleep. I have not gone out to the back porch again. I will probably sell the boat. I do not know about the house. I do not know about anything. I am 17 and I have a senior year starting in 2 weeks, and a college application essay that is due in October, and a grandfather who has not been found. And the calculation that he made in the 3 seconds between the second pair of footprints appearing and the moment he told me to get in the cabin is a calculation I am going to carry for the rest of my life. And the calculation that I made when I closed the hatch, instead of refusing to close it, is a calculation I'm going to carry for the rest of my life. And the calculation that I made when I sat with the messenger in my hand and did not press the button is a calculation I'm going to carry for the rest of my life. And the calculation that I made when I sat on the back porch 2 nights ago and did not look at the canal is a calculation I have just made. The most recent one, the one that tells me what kind of man I am becoming. The man I am becoming is the man who does not look. The man I am becoming is the man who does not press the button. The man I am becoming is the man who closes the hatch when he is told to close the hatch and stays inside it while the person on the other side of it goes where he has to go. I think I knew, the moment I closed the hatch, that I had become this man. I have been this man for less than 2 weeks. I will be this man for 60 years, if I am lucky. And the luck of being this man for 60 years is a luck I did not earn, and that my grandfather paid for. And I'm writing it down on the back of a charter receipt so that someone will know, even if no one ever reads it, that the boy who came back on the helicopter was not the same boy who went out on the boat, and that the difference between them is a hatch that was closed from the inside by hands that should have refused, while a man on the other side of it spoke in the calm voice he used for guests and asked 3 times to be left alone. The pen is running out. I'm going to stop. There is one more receipt under this one. I will not need it. I am going to put the pages in the dry box tomorrow. I am going to drive to the marina in the morning, and I'm going to walk down to the boat, and I'm going to open the dry box, and I'm going to put the pages in. The pelican on the 3rd piling will be there because the pelican is always there. Frank. His name is Frank. I will not wave at him.